Hello and welcome to WorldCanvass. My name is Joan Kerr. WorldCanvass is a production of international programs at the University of Iowa, and we're very happy to have you with us for this program focusing on a pivotal figure of the 20th century, Mohandas or Mahatma Gandhi. Revered around the world for his activism, self-sacrifice, and nonviolent methods of confronting a repressive global power, Gandhi remains a much admired figure today, but Gandhi was a controversial figure in his own time, and perceptions in 2021 are no less mixed. 2019 was the 150th anniversary of Gandhi's birth, and we've gathered an exceptional group of scholars to reflect on the man, his place in history, and the legacy that remains decades after his death. In our program tonight, we're going to break the discussion into three segments. The first will focus on Gandhi and nonviolence, the second on caste, and the third will be devoted to Gandhi's legacy. It is my great pleasure to introduce my first guests. Rajmohan Gandhi is a research professor in education policy, organization, and leadership at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Clayborne Carson is the Martin Luther King Jr. Centennial Professor Emeritus at Stanford University and Director of the Martin Luther King Jr. Institute. And Joseph Alter is a professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Pittsburgh. Welcome. It's an honor to have you join us this evening. You are the grandson of Mohandas Gandhi, Rajmohan. Thank you for joining us. What a pleasure to talk with you.
Well, I'm delighted to be with you and everybody else.
Thank you. I believe you were 12 when your grandfather was assassinated. How close had you been during your young life?
Well, you know, he was much of the time in British prisons, so I didn't see him all that often. Or he was in different parts of the country, but he did spend the final 2 years of his life, not continuously, but large chunks of it in New Delhi, which is where my father was working as editor. And during that time, in his final 2 years, I saw a good deal of it. When he was going from 76 to 78, and I was going from 10 to 12.
Well, there's so much, of course, to say about that family relationship and your own personal life. But tonight we want to focus in this first segment of the program on your grandfather's views on nonviolence as a tactical tool for political and social change. How did Gandhi view nonviolence?
So, of course, I think as far as I know, Gandhi was perhaps the first to use even the phrase nonviolent or nonviolent direct action for political change or to fight against injustice. And Martin Luther King Jr., of course, then used it powerfully and effectively. And it was King who said in 59, in one of his sermons in Birmingham, Alabama, that Gandhi was able, without lifting a gun, without uttering a single curse word, he forced the British Empire to leave. So Gandhi, when he was in his 20s and 30s, in India and then in South Africa, where he spent some time. So he ran into officers of the empire, or those who were for white supremacy in South Africa, people who believed that they felt honored by the humiliation of others. So this is what Gandhi reacted against, people feeling honored by the humiliation of others. And he decided he would fight it, but he also decided that he would not give to others the humiliation that he himself had experienced. And so this was the root of nonviolence, the strategy of nonviolence.
Are there links between Gandhi's views on nonviolence and Thoreau's civil disobedience?
Of course, a great many links. But it's worth noting that although Thoreau's book was published in the late 1840s, from what little I have researched, Gandhi, tremendous admirer of Thoreau, and in his book Hind Swaraj, a very famous book of Gandhi's, short book, published in 1910, he makes lots of references to Thoreau. However, his first struggle for justice for the Indian community of South Africa against the white rulers of South Africa, a nonviolent struggle, took place in 1907, 1908, before he had studied Thoreau. And my research tells me that when he was imprisoned by the South African regime, in prison, that is for the first time he made a deeper study of Thoreau's book.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. You know, in preparation for this program, I rewatched a movie that I know many of us have seen, and this is the film Gandhi by Attenborough, and there is a moment where one of the speakers mentions that it's time to get beyond passive resistance, and Gandhi says, I'm not a proponent of passive resistance. I believe that we need to be provocative and push our claims forward and so on. Tell us, yeah. Expand on that a little bit for me.
So Gandhi was very emphatic on that he was in his own expression, he was a militant fighter, but not a violent fighter. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And he did not want other people to be humiliated, but he wasn't going to accept humiliation for himself or for his people. Right. He didn't want any of the oppressed people of the world to accept humiliation. He wanted them to fight back. Mm-hmm. But this was, of course, a very tough call. Mm-hmm. You want to fight, and yet you don't want to hate the enemy. In fact, you want to love the enemy. Mm-hmm. It was a very tough call. Mm-hmm. But the strategy of nonviolent direct action did mobilize so many people, not only in India, United States, but in other parts of the world.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Help us understand why there was so much violence at the moment of independence.
Well, there was a very interesting African-American figure called William Stewart Nelson, who was connected with Howard University in Washington, D.C. And he was in India in 46, 47 at the time of independence. And Gandhi was at that time in Eastern India. It's today Bangladesh, which was then one single united country. But already as independence was about to come, but violence was already taking place in different parts of India. So Nelson said to Gandhi, you have been preaching nonviolence to India for 30 years. Why then so much violence today? So Gandhi said, you're asking me a very difficult question, but a very important question. Now here, I'm not giving you exactly Gandhi's words, but I'm paraphrasing what Gandhi said. Gandhi said to Nelson that I've been asking India to do two things, Indians, fear not and hate not. Don't fear the British, don't hate the British. Gandhi said, fear not was more popular than hate not. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And he said, willingness to hate the white man soon became a willingness to hate the fellow Indian. Mm-hmm. The desire to hate somebody or willingness to hate somebody became willingness to hate. If you were a Muslim, to hate the Hindu. If you were a Hindu, hate the Muslim. Mm-hmm. So it was the inability of Indians to accept the hate not part of his message that he felt. This was his understanding.
Yeah. Could you offer a comparison between India's struggle for freedom from British rule with the Black struggle here in the United States for freedom and equality?
Well, I can make one or two general remarks. I think it's important to note that India was under, you might say, the imperialist heel. The British Empire was very strong. However, even at the height of British power in India, the number of white soldiers or white civilians who were controlling India was very small compared with the vast Indian population. So the Indians who led by Gandhi were fighting non-violently for independence, had tremendous support in the population. The vast majority of the people of India were rooting for the non-violent fighters. Mm-hmm. But when the African Americans were fighting for justice here, I'm not talking about the entire history of 400 years, but say during the 20th century, King and others with him. So they were faced with a large population which was not in favor. So So this was a very major difference.
Mm-hmm.
It was in some ways tougher in the United States,
mm-hmm.
because there were, yes, many in the white population also, some quickly and some after some time, were willing to support or at least to not stand in the way. But a large section of the population was absolutely against the struggle. Mm-hmm. So yes, there was the oppression in India too. The British rule with its guns and its tanks. It wasn't a child's play to overthrow British rule.
Right.
But the fact that there was this very great support from the populace around the fighters made a big difference in India, which was lacking here to begin with in the United States.
Right, right. Well, perhaps that leads us to our next guest, Clayborne Carson. Pleasure to have you here. And as I mentioned earlier, you're a professor at Stanford University, and you also direct the Martin Luther King Jr. Research and Education Institute. As we know, Gandhi is perhaps best known here in the U.S. for his influence on leaders of the nonviolent civil rights movement in the 50s and in the 60s. Martin Luther King, of course, comes to mind. But there are other critically important Black leaders who took Gandhi's example very seriously. Who were these Black Gandhians?
Black. I refer to them as the Black Gandhians because I think that there is a tradition within the Black community, as Rajmohan has pointed out, of looking to other countries, and India was one of the most promising examples, because when you think about it, by the turn of the century, at the time when the NAACP is formed in 1909, it didn't look very hopeful for Black Americans. We had been through the segregation laws had really strengthened in the late 19th century. So they were facing this uphill fight, and they look over and see in India that Gandhi's having some impact in India. So almost from the time Gandhi arrives in India, arrives back in India, and begins to identify with the movement for independence, he is featured in Black newspapers. I went back and looked at the Crisis magazine, which was the NAACP magazine, edited by W.E.B. Du Bois, probably the most prominent Black intellectual of the 20th century. And there's an article in it in 1922 about Gandhi in India. And Gandhi, Du Bois later writes to Gandhi, and Gandhi replies with an article, which is published in the Crisis magazine in, I think it's 1929. And then after that, Howard Thurman, a Black minister, very prominent, wants to go to India. And this is in the 30s, mid-1930s, when it's very difficult for Americans of all races, but Black Americans in particular, to make such a long trip. But they go and meet personally with Gandhi in 1936 and ask him questions about how they can apply his ideas. They are not all convinced immediately that these ideas would work in the United States. The idea of nonviolence is something that that there's some acceptance out of necessity, but making it a principle, it was difficult for some. But this delegation and Howard Thurman's influence on King, he is the dean of the chapel at Boston University when Martin Luther King is a graduate student there. He writes a book, Jesus and the Disinherited, that has a great impact. But there are other people. Benjamin Mays also goes with as part of this delegation. And I had the pleasure of meeting Sue Bailey Thurman, Thurman's wife, who actually came to the King Institute on one occasion. So this goes back to the 20s and 30s. And by the 1940s, you have other people. Bayard Rustin goes there. He's later King's major advisor after the Montgomery bus boycott. So when Martin Luther King emerges as a leader, he's all listened to people who have been to India, who have absorbed Gandhian ideas. He goes to a lecture in 1950s when he's still a student, and goes out and buys every book that he can find about Gandhi. But I think the most important of these was James Lawson, who went to India after Gandhi's death, but specifically he went there. He was drafted into the military, and this was his way of avoiding military service by becoming a missionary in India. But he used that as an opportunity to read as much as he could about Gandhian ideas, came back to the United States, became King's advisor, but perhaps more importantly, he developed a workshop of young people, mostly students, in the late 1950s. And that group became leaders of the sit-ins of the early 1960s, and later the Freedom Rides. So they actually absorbed these ideas to the point where they wanted to apply them in the United States. So you had a Gandhian movement at the heart of the modern civil rights movement. These students did not, actually one of the things that's interesting about them, that they did not see themselves as necessarily followers of Martin Luther King. They saw themselves as in the lead of the movement, that they were the vanguard, and that Martin Luther King needed to catch up with them because they were actually using civil disobedience on a pretty massive scale. There were close to 500 students arrested in the Freedom Rides, and who spent most of the summer of 1961 in Parchman Penitentiary in Mississippi. Mm-hmm. So that group, I think, was really, even more than Martin Luther King, responsible for showing that these ideas could work in the United States.
Yeah.
King, I think, absorbed the ideas, but he was actually fairly reluctant to practice civil disobedience. He did on certain occasions, but not with the enthusiasm of the young people who had been trained by James Lawson.
Mm-hmm. How much did it matter that so many of us in various parts of the country, all parts of the country, could watch the evening news and see what was happening with the Freedom Riders in the South, or with sit-ins, with people being hosed and dogs being sent after peaceful protesters in various parts of America? How I believe that in my own, my own growth, it made an incredible difference to be able to see with my own eyes what was happening to people in our country. And how do you feel about the exposure that came from television and other kinds of media here in the struggle in the U.S.?
Well, I think it was important that the Black movement gained this militancy, and it was called militancy at the time, even though it was nonviolent, mm-hmm. because it was aggressive. As Rajmohan has pointed out, this was not passive. There was nothing that was passive about it. It was taking, and in fact, the Freedom Rides went into the areas of greatest resistance in the South. Yeah. Because they had the idea that if you brought this technique, and I think Lawson would not call it a technique, it was a philosophy of nonviolent resistance, and that if you showed that you were not afraid of what the kind of response, even if it meant your death or getting brutalized when they tried to use white waiting rooms at bus stations. Yeah. And of course, spending that summer in prison, that didn't stop them. Many of the ones who spent the summer of 61 in prison made a decision that they were not going to go back to college. that they were going to join the movement full time. And these are the ones who became the field secretaries of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee.
Right.
And these were the people who, when I was a teenager, these were the people I admired, because they're the ones who did not seem to have the fear of, I had grown up hearing the Emmett Till story of what happened to a black teenager who was murdered in Mississippi. So the notion of voluntarily going into the heart of segregation and fighting violence with nonviolence, that was something that was very exciting to me. Although I didn't immediately go off and join the Freedom Riders.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, let me bring Dr. Alter into the discussion. Joseph Alter, a professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Pittsburgh. Thank you so much for being here. Let me just turn the question of Gandhi's thinking on violence to you. In what ways has he influenced the world, both in his own time and today?
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to join the stage with my distinguished colleagues. I've been interested in questions that relate to how Gandhi not only advocated to practice what you preach, but to embody your practice. And there are really interesting aspects of his teaching, which I think are lessons for real on-the-ground practice about how to internalize and embody what some have referred to as the high ideals, but are essentially pragmatic guidelines for putting into practice on a fundamentally embodied level the principles of nonviolence. And I've also been interested in the way in which he's really a cosmopolitan world philosopher, even though that has been applied in practice in the context of the freedom struggle. And in particular, looking at how he advocated diet reform, for example, as linked to the way in which to confront racism. I mean, many people stop and say, how can those two things be connected? But what he was really trying to do was, I think, and this is evidence from his writings, is to experiment with methods by which to make your commitment to ideals comprehensive in the full sense of all aspects of practice. And as I think others have pointed out, both this evening and in the literature, he was drawing on ideas that were coming from all over the world. And I think it's really important to recognize how his impact has been global, but his inspiration was also global. And obviously his achievements in the context of the freedom struggle are unambiguously powerful, but they tend to eclipse his significance as a world philosopher. And I think that there's real importance in recognizing that and remembering it. I've been especially interested in how, you can look at different aspects of his advocacy for nonviolent resistance, and then see how that is connected to the experiments in his ashrams, for example, where he was advocating health reform amongst his followers as the basis upon which to develop their moral fiber, you might say, to be able to be committed to these ideals. And he himself, reflecting on his very staunch advocacy for nature cure, which he himself referred to as kind of quackery, is nevertheless something which reflects a kind of environmental consciousness about the extent to which his approach to healing and his approach to the world engaged with the nonviolence of self-care that could empower the activism to stand up against the most overwhelming forms of violence. And it's interesting to see how he articulated that in a way that, from the standpoint of rational pragmatists, sounds like it makes no sense whatsoever. But if you look at the day-to-day life in the ashrams, in particular, Nisargopchar ashram outside of Pune, which he established as a health clinic to help in the development of rural reform and rural uplift. There are really interesting ways in which he was imagining the world in a way that transcended the way in which we tend to distinguish between nature and culture. And he saw that as the mechanism by which to confront the evils of industrial exploitation in a way that provided an alternative vision of a way in which society could be expanded out from the microcosm of these ashrams. And the extent of his detailed interest in how that related to working in the kitchen, for example, is, I think, really important to remember, given how profound his success was in achieving nonviolence on a level that we all know about very, very well. But it was fine-grained, it was down to earth, it was in the practice of everyday life as well.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned working in the kitchen. Can you tell us what this meant to him?
Absolutely. It's not to, in any sense, reduce what he did to that level of seeming mundane procedures. Mm-hmm. But he, for example, there's a striking case, I think, in Young India, where he says that everyone in the ashram should be adept at both being able to prepare food and clean the toilets, and to be able to see in a way the importance of the value of work in those two aspects that are linked to the body in obvious ways, and to be able to thereby experience, in the full sense of experience, the presence of being in an environment where your work in the kitchen and in the toilet gives you a perspective on the microcosm that expands outward to be encompassing of the world.
Sure. I wonder if I can open the last couple of minutes here for further conversation. If you, Professor Gandhi or Professor Carson, have anything you would like to say or build off of Joe's remarks.
I think what I would add to them is that I've traveled in India and gone to a number of the ashrams that Gandhi founded. And I think one thing I would have as a caution is that often the philosophical and broader ideas associated with Gandhian nonviolence leads to an isolation. Just an example of this, during the riots in Ahmedabad, when many Muslims were being attacked, and there was this major violence that happened, I guess it was about 15, 20 years ago now, and the response of the ashram there was to close its gates, rather than to go out into the community and intercede within this violence, which I think Gandhi would have done. But there is, and I think the equivalent in the United States is that idea of, you immerse yourself in a community of people who are, in a sense, separating themselves from the rest of the world. And I think one of the things that was interesting about James Lawson and his work is that he said, you have to go through training, you have to go through months of preparation before you practice nonviolence. You have to know the philosophical roots, but the ultimate goal was to engage, was to go out and take that knowledge out and change the world. And I think sometimes it becomes you change yourself. And in doing that, you're isolating yourself from the world. So I think that that's one of the critiques that I offer And it's not, I don't think, where is the line between that isolation and the engagement? I think that's one of the things that people who believe in nonviolence have to confront of when do you become so immersed in an alternative way of life that you don't have any impact in the world as it is.
Right.
May I come in there for a second?
Please.
I absolutely endorse what Clay has said. I think it's tremendous, and it's very relevant in today's India. By the way, what Joe also said is also extremely relevant in today's India, because making India physically clean is as crucial a need, a national need. It's not just a personal matter. So he made a tremendous point, but I think the point Clay makes is also absolutely important. And when I said that African Americans fighting for their equality here had faced a very tough challenge because much of the population was not in favor of them. The same is true in today's India, when there is this tremendous injection of hatred of the Muslims, who are a very crucial minority, 14-15% of the Indian population. There are the Dalits, the so-called former untouchables, the Adivasis, the so-called tribals, and the Muslims. These three taken together are the blacks of today's India. And they face tremendous difficulties, persecution, oppression. And so Gandhian nonviolence and those who want justice and equality and fairness have to address these tremendous challenges in today's India. So I'm grateful for what Clay pointed out.
Mm-hmm. Well, gosh, thank you all so much. I'm afraid we've come to the end of this segment, but I do want to thank you all, Rajmohan Gandhi, Clayborne, Carson, and Joe Alter, for joining us for this first part of the program. We'll be back in just a moment with a conversation about caste. I'm Joan Kerr, and this is WorldCanvass from University of Iowa International Programs. Hello again, and welcome to part 2 of WorldCanvass. Our topic is Gandhi at 150. Caste is the focus of this part of our program. Caste is a form of social stratification that defines groups as having more or less privilege, establishes that some are seen as more or less worthy, signals more or less opportunity, persists generation after generation, and is the often unspoken but deeply ingrained determinant of one's place in the world. Many of us are aware of a caste system in India, but until recently, I don't think caste was a construct most of us recognized in the American story. But Isabel Wilkerson is changing that. In her recent book, Caste, Wilkerson makes the case that the systemic and seemingly insurmountable problems we have in our own country are in fact born of a caste system. To discuss caste in India in historical terms and also its present manifestations, we'll be rejoined by Rajmohan Gandhi and joined for the first time by Suraj Yangde. I'd like to go first to Rajmohan Gandhi. Rajmohan, as you know, is a research professor in education policy and organization and leadership at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. He's an historian, an author, and has been a member of the Indian Parliament, led the Indian delegation to the UN Human Rights Commission in Geneva, and is the former president of Initiatives of Change International. Rajmohan is also the grandson of Mahatma Gandhi. Thank you again for being with us in this part of the program, Rajmohan. Yeah, I wonder if you can help us understand how Gandhi viewed caste hierarchies.
Well, he was totally opposed to them, totally and frontally opposed to them. But here, let me point this out. We earlier discussed nonviolent direct action for independence. Now, broadly speaking, Gandhi had 3 very tough goals, big goals, apart from personal goals. There was India's independence from British rule. And there was the Hindu-Muslim situation, tension. There's been tension for a long time, how to bring these two groups together. And thirdly, the caste question and the hierarchies and the horrible and unspeakably horrible treatment of the so-called untouchables. So Gandhi fought on all those 3 fronts. But he had to prioritize his struggles. Yeah, on the caste question, those who have studied his life know that early on in his married life. He went to South Africa as a young couple, and he had Indians of untouchable background staying in his home, which, for Indians, by conventional Indian standards, that was quite a revolutionary step. But he asks his wife to deal with the chamber pot of this guest who is, so to speak, quote unquote, from an untouchable background. And because she's reluctant to do what she does, Gandhi is very tough with her. He's domineering. He's demanding that she should join him in his social reform activities. So they're there, and because his wife fights back, and which is good that she fights back. But then later on, when he returns to India and he starts his work in India, he starts the center, the ashram, and he admits an untouchable family in the ashram. And his wife again reacts, and some others react. And he even says to his wife, well, if you want to go, you can go. But I have to have these people in my center. So in his personal life and his family life, he was radical and revolutionary from the start. But he needed the caste Hindus, the so-called high caste Hindus, for the freedom movement. He couldn't alienate them so that they would resist his freedom movement. He needed them for Hindu-Muslim reconciliation and partnership. So he had to impose, often in his life, a restraint on himself on how radical he could be to oppose caste. But as his life continued and as the freedom movement advanced, he became more and more radical in the latter part of his life.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You know, we didn't talk about this in the first segment, but I wonder, we're talking about caste, but I know that Gandhi was accused or has been accused by some as being racist when he was in South Africa. Is that fair?
No. In short, it is totally unfair. Those who want to assess Gandhi's time in South Africa between 1893 and 1915 have to understand that period. And in that period, those who afterwards became leaders of the African nationalist movement, there's a man called John Dubé, one of the founders of the African National Congress, who was one of Gandhi's friends in South Africa. Gandhi, in his small printing press, printed John Dubé's journal. They were in the same area near Durban. So, and then there's this man called Albert Luthuli. Most people don't know his name now, but he was the first South African to get the Nobel Prize for fighting apartheid in South Africa in 1961. This was years before Mandela, years before Archbishop Tutu. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So now, what does Luthuli, and Mandela calls Luthuli Gandhi's passionate disciple. And Luthuli, speaking in the United States in 1948, he refers to John Dubé, who was Gandhi's friend, in 1905, and then one of those who started the African National Congress. And Luthuli said in Washington, D.C., in a talk at Harvard University, that what Gandhi did for the Indians of South Africa inspired John Dubé and others to do the same for the Africans in South Africa. Mm-hmm. So although Gandhi didn't directly take part in the freedom movement of the Africans, what he did for the Indians played a very considerable part in what the African leaders were later able to achieve.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Yeah, please. Did you have something else you wanted?
Yes, because, two professors in South Africa of Indian origin have written a book about Gandhi's alleged racism, and people should read that book. It has lots of interesting information. I've also studied that book with care. It is interesting because it does show that at that time, Gandhi did support the British rulers of South Africa. He did not take part in the African struggle. But it also shows people like John Dubé, they also did not take part in the African struggle. There was a very courageous but failed rebellion, the Bambata rebellion of 1905 or 6 in South Africa. But the African leaders themselves were opposed to it. And in this book, which does detail Gandhi's alleged, in my opinion, incorrectly assessed racism in South Africa, the important point to note is there is not a single reference in that book of any Indian in South Africa or any African in South Africa at that time, or any Indian at that time in India, disagreeing even in the slightest way, or criticizing Gandhi in the slightest way. There is no contemporary criticism of Gandhi in South Africa at that time. So today, if we take some isolated, and there were many remarks Gandhi made at that time that were foolish remarks, were remarks he should not have made. But they did not indicate racism. They indicated some ignorance. They indicated the time. It's important to note that at that time, not a single African, not a single Indian in South Africa or in India criticized Gandhi's approach. Those times were very different from today.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you very much for that. And now I'd like to introduce our next guest, Suraj Yangde, a senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School and the author of Caste Matters. Great pleasure to have you with us here today, Suraj, for WorldCanvass. Thank you.
Thank you, Joan.
Mm-hmm. So to get us started, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about your own background.
I come from India. I am one of the Dalits. Within Indian landscape, the social sphere is deeply divided and deeply discriminatory. So it's a very difficult life for someone like me to survive in the caste chamber that emits obnoxious sense of derogatory policies as well as societal attitudes that makes it difficult. And I come from a community where every day 10 women from my community get raped. And 5 men from my community men and women both get murdered. And my community is the one who cleans the human excreta. They are forced to do that job. And every 5th day, one Dalit who enters a manhole comes out as a dead body.
So I can only imagine how difficult it was for you to get the education you received and to accomplish what you have so far in your life. How did you? I know I don't want to say leave that community, because you are clearly still very, very connected emotionally, at least, with the community you've come from. But you are now here in the United States and traveling elsewhere in the world. You're a respected scholar. How did this change happen for you?
Ambedkar, he inspired many people like me to pursue education. Ambedkar is the contemporary of, so to speak, our protagonist today, Gandhi. Who himself was highly educated of his times, 2 doctorates, one in Columbia, actually an outcome of 2 educational towering locations, America and London. And he did unthinkable, the first untouchable to achieve whatever he could. And we are talking about the early 1910s and 20s.
Yeah.
And ends up writing India's constitution. So for a community whose history has been wiped off from the slate as if they don't exist and they don't matter, to look at the past and think about something is unthinkable, because you don't know anything. It's almost everything. You're staring in darkness where there is no light. And so Ambedkar is that force that comes as an inspiration, and almost he described himself as Moses-like character for his people.
Yeah. Well, we heard Professor Gandhi's response to a question about Gandhi and caste. Do you have thoughts about that as well?
Yeah, Professor Gandhi was correct when he was describing about Gandhi's foot in many locations and his emphasis on India's independence. Whenever we try to understand independence, we have to see what the oppressed think about that independence. Was that independence going to bring any significant change in the life of the most crushed people who have been destined to the most despicable life that they can have? is there a guarantee that the elite castes will consider them as their compatriots in the broader fraternities? Mm-hmm. And if we have a certain answer to this, then we might have to rethink, what does independence entail? Mm-hmm. Does it really bring about a fundamental change in the life of those people who want to alter and change their lives for better good? Dalits did not see hope in that, because it's basically replacing white men with the elite caste who already were dominating us. India has repeated episodes of colonizations. The Aryans came, imposed caste system, and so we have a record of 3,000 year plus colonizations. If you look through my experience and my ancestors' experience and the tribal people, the indigenous Indians, we were subjugated to an untouchable status by the colonizers. So British period legally is 90 years from Queen's Proclamation to the departure of British year rule. And if you add East India Company, you might add 100 years here and there. Mm-hmm. What does it mean in the broader picture of 5,000 years of civilization?
Sure. Is there anti-caste activism in India and also here in the US?
Very much so. It's actually, and it's very interesting that the Hindus who espouse a certain dharmic value and a value of nonviolence and peace, these are all clishmack-clevers. These are all foolish attributes that one brings forth when you brutally suppress the voice of dissent from an untouchable like me. When I bring out these voices right now, I've been complained by the Hindu American groups to Harvard for raising the issues because I am being disrespectful to Hinduism. So when we talk about this, it's a fascist. Brahminism is fascism in India. And people who are part of this upper order are beneficiaries. You might comfortably reject that. You might despise that, but you benefit from that because it's a system, it's a structure that is standing on our throats. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And if our throats are removed, it will crumble. So for it to survive, it has to keep on killing us. Mm-hmm. And in that order, we see a very brutal system, not only existing in India, but also its outposts, which are existing not only America, elsewhere too. And this is not unique to, and this is growing. This is really growing. Fascism was a problem for us, much part of the 20th century. Brahminism, I fear, might become the 21st century's malady.
So within India, may I classify the pro-caste folks as right-wing? You're referring to them as fascist groups, the Brahmins?
No, they are left-wing, they are centrist and right-wing too, because they are invested in preserving the order, even though they might criticize, but we don't see. We had left governments in India. You still have untouchables begging on the streets. You have centrist governments harassing us for so many years, and now the right-wing. For us, this don't change. The point is, if you look from a black person's perspective in America, a white person having in the position doesn't mean nothing. Might be, a person from different political party and stuff like that, but they inherit a structure that's not gonna threaten their own kids.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, they want to protect, but at what cost? At the cost of black people, the black kids they're going to kill. Same is with us. So the people who come with this abominations of the system mean nothing to us unless and until the structure is altogether subverted, not changed. This is a structure of hierarchy. We want to make it like this. But for that to achieve, we want to hit equality. Mm-hmm. And for us to have equal structure, we need a radical approach of how do we replace these hierarchies. And the liberal order cannot do that because it has failed time and again. That's why is right-wing on rise? Because liberalism fails. I mean, this is a theory. I mean, London River Books just came out with an excellent article on rise of conservatism. And the purpose is that liberal values have really worked with protecting both interests. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, Gandhi was one of those who couldn't really satisfy the hunger and thirst of people who were really fighting for liberation, not just freedom.
So do you see any future for the elimination of the caste structure in India? I mean, do you believe that that's possible within your lifetime? Is this a goal that can be reached?
That's why I'm alive.
Yeah.
We are hopeful, we're optimistic, and we'll continue to fight. We need more people like me in the spaces who will usher their breath into that dialogue.
Mm-hmm.
One can philosophize moribund ideas. One can overtly canonize individuals and hagiographies and think about a particular person. But my question remains, why were African Americans not told about Ambedkar?
Mm-hmm.
The natural alliance for Black people are Dalits, not Baniyas, not Brahmins, not the high caste people.
Mm-hmm.
The enemy, which is white enemy, is different than what is white enemy for India, a colonial structure, and here a settler structure.
Mm-hmm.
And so the question is, when MLK goes to India, why is he not even told that, hey, you know what, like you, there is an untouchable leader here. You might want to know. But I think it's the policy of the Congress government
Mm-hmm.
who really suppressed everything that had to do with Ambedkar and the dignity. And it's only now, 70 years later, people like me are trying to fill that gap that 70 years were wasted under the patronage of the high caste oppressors.
Yeah. What is the position of progressive white, Black, and South Asian groups on caste?
In America?
Yeah, in America or, worldwide.
I mean, it's to my experience, there have been quite a, genuine interest
Mm-hmm.
Amongst all the groups, including South Asians, who really would like to put themselves to test.
Mm-hmm.
And very much have a Socratic dialogue as to start from your own criticisms. Can we really have that dialogue with a caste system in place? It's an order that you deliver, and the receiver has to accept it because it's placed on an unequal plane. But with this growing resurgence of scholarship that is really displacing the existing models that are not having any concrete ideas of liberation of oppressed peoples, the interest is growing, and across the board, at least wherever I go, I've seen this interest coming across people. They want to know more about it. They want to think about this. Also, there exists a group among these people also, which really tries to be mischievous in their interpretation, in their deliverance, in their even in their scholastic documentation of whatever we are doing. And it's just depressing to see, and it's sad that people who would expect, especially in the educated university spaces or within the media spaces, especially the dominant caste people, they really tend to attend to these issues. And the affection of Hindu values among white people, especially the hippie culture white, is really fraught, because once you ask them what about the caste system, it's always put as a third agenda, like Gandhi did.
Yeah. So I understand that the current Indian government is not making moves, correct, to change the caste structure. What would be some first steps, if there were an opening? Is education for all people in all levels of society, is education a way out?
Oh, indeed. I think, and I think we need to, that's where Ambedkar comes crucial. He asked us, stay hungry, but get educated. Mm-hmm. And that's, as unthinkable, that's basically the first hammer into the structure of caste. It's not going on it, it's going in it. And education has helped us, but still the discrimination and exclusion that continues to take place. I'll just highlight the statistics. When kids enter school by 6 to 11 years old, 89% of Dalit kids are in the class. But then when they go to high school to college, it drops down to 60%. And by the time they go to university, only 11% of them are there. And of that 11, 2.49% only graduate. So I'm one of those 2.4% of the 300 million Dalits we have in India. And
would you say that it's mostly it's the inability to not provide that helpful role for your family in terms of helping to gain income and so on. Is that what keeps some of the students from progressing forward, or they're just not able to be admitted because the next level school, maybe the university, just doesn't want to have more than a small percentage of numbers of Dalits in their admissions group? What is it that keeps those kids from progressing all the way through?
It's the family condition. These are the children of servants, maids, chauffeurs, people who work on construction sites. These are the people who are in the lowest chain, and they are so vulnerable that a slight change in their lifestyle will just eliminate them from the order.
Yeah.
And in addition to that, we have a structural casteism. It's no accident that parents, when they're sending their kids in such numbers, 81% going primary school, by the time they go to university, 20 years of time, the structure did not encourage them to stay in school. It worked full time to exclude. And with that comes the responsibility of how who is teaching and how the education curriculum is conducted. 74% of university faculties in India are high caste Hindus. And let me just place you the number. The percentage of high caste Hindus is only 16% of India's population. So 16% cover almost 75%. So we see disparity. India lives in apartheid state.
Yeah. Is there any difference in between traditional villages and the big cosmopolitan cities in the way caste is reflected or observed? Is there any difference?
And this is where whenever rural and urban fascination comes, critique of Gandhi has to come. Gandhi believed in the village republic, which was not his idea. It was a Scottish scholar who advocated, who really romanticized the idea of village republic. Village republic is basically a cesspool for Dalits. It is a strict hierarchy. You work for your landlord. You are disgusted under the conditions of subhumanity, and your women get raped by the landowning caste. So if you're from a dominant caste, you might love it. It's a Mars. It's a new tablet that you want to have your safe moment. But for Dalits, it is not. And so for us, village life has never been of equal because we never owned resources. We were the chattels for disposal whenever we want to. Our children, by the time they stand on their feet, are taught how to tend farms instead of teaching how to catch pens. And that's why in rural areas, that condition has remained unchanged. And this is, there is no doubt on any circles from any ideologies who openly confess, because if you go to Indian village, and I encourage people to go, there are two villages in one village. One is the village, and other is the ghetto, the untouchables ghetto. And many times I went to village, and if I go, there are always two, and Dalits are excluded from the main civic. They live about a kilometer or two away from the village. And so even if you have to fetch water, you have to pass by village. And by passing by villages mean to attributing to the courts. You have to remove your slippers. You have to have a certain mannerisms. You cannot have yourself most exposed, and you cannot spit. You can only walk through at certain hours. And this is a condition I'm talking about right now. This might really sound anachronistic and old, but this is what is happening, major. And we continue to see this incorporated. So even for water, they need to rely on high castes. Which we call oppressor caste or criminal castes, and these criminals then have a social boycotting if Dalits void any of the caste rules they impose. So urbanization was the approach, and many times when one Dalit commits, let's say, blasphemy of a Hindu religious order, which is to challenge caste system, it is not one person who receives punishment. It is an entire village, the ghetto of Dalits. That's why you see displacement of Dalits leaving their households for several generations and moving en masse. And when they go to urban areas, they become the beggars. They are the people who you see on the streets because they have not been accommodated into the urban structure. That's why Indian Dalits remain the refugees of India's current system.
Yeah. Well, maybe just one last question. What would it take for the current generation to address caste?
I think we need to be confessing our faults, like white people in America do, at least the liberal ones. I'm not talking about other ones who at least what we saw George Floyd last summer. Some of them were brave enough to confess, and they fought against their own white people. I've never seen a dominant caste person getting into fist fights, not just intellectual fights. We need fights on both levels. We can't just have melodies of dialogue to take place. We haven't seen the liberals who profess certain values of India, South Asia, religion, the cosmopolitanism, and cherish it, never taking the arms to fight against their own people. Mm-hmm. There is no progress if the dominant caste fight against themselves. And the ones who believe in the humanity of themselves, and as well as the most vulnerable, it is upon them to take the responsibility, because the Dalit is already fighting the hell that has been imposed on them. Mm-hmm. And they can't take another extra layer of oppression and burden on them. And if that happens, and we want people encouraging that, fight against your own kinds and fight it like Dalits are fighting. Don't fight it like you want to fight, because in your fight, you'll be more soft, you'll be more vanilla, you'll be more delicate. We don't need that. We need aggressive action that will really profess a firm resolution, or else we will have the same dialogue with my grandchildren and your descendants.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Oh gosh, well, thank you so much for joining us for this important discussion, Suraj. A real pleasure to talk to you. I also want to say thank you to Rajmohan Gandhi, who joined us earlier in this segment. This is WorldCanvass from UI International Programs, and I'm Joan Kerr. We'll be back in just a moment with our final group of guests who will consider Gandhi's legacy. Thank you. Welcome back to WorldCanvass. I'm Joan Kerr for UI International Programs, and we're pleased to have you with us for our program on Gandhi. This program is being recorded and will be available on the International Programs website, the Public Radio Exchange, iTunes, and YouTube. Our guests in this final part of the program will share their thoughts on Gandhi's legacy. I'm pleased to introduce our three guests: Paul Greeno, Professor Emeritus in the Department of History at the University of Iowa; Miti Mukherjee, Associate Professor in the Department of History at the University of Colorado at Boulder; and Timothy Dobe, a Professor in the Department of Religious Studies at Grinnell College. Welcome to you all. Paul, if I may, I'd like to go to you first for your thoughts on Gandhi's legacy.
Thank you, Joan. And I have to say that I feel like I've taken an astringent bath after listening to Suraj Jengde. I'm still trying to recover and absorb and pour through the notes that I took on his extraordinary talk to us. If you're an American, you probably have a favorable view of Gandhi based on the enormous moral authority of Martin Luther King. Gandhi, we know, also was globally considered to be a prophet, a philosopher, and by some even a saint. He was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize on 5 occasions before his death. So among large portions of the world, Gandhi has an intact and even growing reputation. But the fact is that Gandhi's legacy, if by legacy we mean his ideas, his accomplishments, his reputation, is under considerable critique, and in some parts of the world under attack. A few moments ago, Clay was talking about Gandhi in Africa, and I have to say that in South Africa, while there is among certain scholarly perspective, Gandhi's reputation is explored in the influence on John Dewey, for example, as Rajmohan told us, was very considerable. Among the populace at large, insofar as they think about Gandhi, I would say Gandhi's reputation is in tatters. A few years back, I went to Durban with a group of students and other faculty members, and we visited a couple of the ashrams and settlements of Gandhi, and was astonished to see that all the structures had been torn to pieces and were being used basically for firewood. There's a broad hostility to Gandhi in South Africa. I'll just sort of put it like that. And the reason for this is that Gandhi made in print a number of very unflattering racial distinctions, statements about the alleged high moral and intellectual capacity of Indians and Europeans, as opposed to the allegedly low capacity of Africans. And knowledge of this is actually very widespread, at least in urban areas of South Africa. But it's in India itself that Gandhi's legacy is most hotly disputed and subject to the most intense criticism. And the focus of it obviously is coming from the community from the Dalit community, for reasons that were just explained. The hostility, the state of hostility between Ambedkar and Gandhi was a feature of history itself in the 30s and the 40s, but subsequently the view has, if anything, intensified. There is no accommodation between Gandhi and the untouchable community. But in addition to that, it's actually the current government of India itself, the BJP, which is the ruling political party in India, has a very, there's some degree of subtlety about it, but it has generally a very hostile view of Gandhi, but it confronts the fact that Indians have, up until the last 10 years or so, have had governments which have emphasized the wisdom, the accomplishment, the saintly qualities, and the martyrdom of Gandhi as a fact of public life. So the present government, the BJP government, is engaged in a rather difficult uphill task of trying to convince the public at large that Gandhi was not a martyr, not a hero, not a saint, not a prophet, and not a philosopher. And in fact, he is a traitor. This is the official position of the BJP party, of party leaders, and of a range of other institutions and organizations close to the government, which is in power. And they have been, with a certain intensity and thoroughness for the last 6 years, set out to either destroy Gandhi or to transform his actual deeds and statements in such a way that he appears to be other than he was. They have tried to turn him into a good Hindu patriot in accord with BJP hopes and expectations. So this is an astonishing development, and probably comes as a bit of a shock to Americans who are used to thinking of Gandhi in entirely different terms.
Yeah, before the program this evening, you and I communicated a little bit, and you said that Gandhi's place in public life in Iowa and in the U.S. since the 20s may reflect some controversy, but he was clearly linked with the nonviolent movement that developed here from the 40s and 50s and 60s during those very important civil rights times here in the U.S. How do you feel his teachings, his example are considered today by the public? Do people remember Gandhi? Do people remember Martin Luther King and the kind of nonviolent resistance was that some of us are old enough to have lived through? But for a couple of generations here, this is history.
Well, I've never seen, for example, a measurement of public opinion about Gandhi's reputation. But both of them, Martin Luther King and Gandhi, are in danger, of course, by becoming celebrated heroes of turning points in our history, or epochs in which history is changed. There's a danger of them being congealed into gods of fixed quality, lacking in personal development or any form of interiority. And I think that's the situation that now we've sort of reached, in which Martin Luther King is celebrated in textbooks. There's a holiday around his birthday, of course. The real Martin Luther King and the struggles of Martin Luther King are not very apparent. Gandhi's influence on Martin Luther King, while well known among the group of people who are watching our WorldCanvass, I think is not part of general knowledge in our country. I may be mistaken, but I don't think it's the case.
How do Indian Americans feel about Gandhi, as far as you know?
Well, that's a very interesting question. It's hard to, one should be careful and not generalize, but generally speaking, Indian Americans favor the political party and the political leadership in India at the moment, which is the BJP party, which has as an integral part of its self-presentation the notion that Gandhi was a traitor, that he was not a good Hindu, that he sold out India to Muslims and Pakistan, and therefore he should not be honored. And insofar as the bulk of public Indians in North America are Hindu, and the bulk of those Hindus are pro-BJP, to some extent they're aware of this hostility. On the other hand, it's clear that the general world opinion of attitude of approval toward Gandhi is a source of pleasure, because it puts India in a very, very good light. So I would say ambivalence would be the word I would offer.
Well, thank you, Paul. Let's move to Miti Mukherjee. And you told me, Miti, prior to today's conversation, that Gandhi brought a new idea of freedom into politics, freedom as spiritual liberation that consisted in losing or going beyond one's identity. Can you tell us what you mean by that?
Yeah, well, first of all, it's a great pleasure for me to be part of this distinguished panel. Thank you very much for inviting me. I think to understand Gandhi's legacy, we need to really understand how Gandhi brought religion and spirituality into the Indian anti-colonial movement against British rule. And we all know that he did that, but the precise nature of spirituality that Gandhi introduced and its implications for Gandhian politics is not always very well understood. And this kind of feeds into what Paul was just talking about. If you read Gandhi's autobiography and his other writings, you come across this term moksha innumerable times. In its English translation, it means a spiritual liberation through self-realization. In fact, Gandhi even goes to the extent of saying that moksha or spiritual liberation was his foremost goal in life, and that national independence, as urgent as it was of secondary importance. So this idea of spiritual liberation, in Jainism and Hinduism, the term is moksha, and in Buddhism, the term is nirvana, is only possible through the loss of one's identity, whether it's individual identity or national, racial, religious, or caste identity. So the pursuit of this highest spiritual goal in these traditions is an experience in transcending all identities. It's important to note that an intrinsic part of this pursuit of spiritual liberation is the renunciation of desires through various ascetic practices. So if one follows Gandhi's life from South Africa until Indian independence, it's clear that he increasingly took on the persona of a renunciate and lived like one. And indeed, that is how people recognized him. Hence the term Mahatma, which is used in India to refer to renunciates and spiritual seekers. It's clear from Gandhi's autobiography and his other works that renunciation and asceticism were central to his life and politics. practices, as Professor Alto was pointing out, such as frequent fasting, celibacy, maintaining silence on certain days of the week, practicing different kinds of diets. But I would like to point out that it's that for Gandhi, humanitarianism, compassion, and ascetic practices were at the spiritual core of all religions, and not just these three religions that I just mentioned. Gandhi was very aware of this opposition between this idea of spiritual liberation based on the transcending of identity and the modern idea of freedom that is anchored in representational politics. So the modern idea that British and other European colonizers took to different parts of Asia and Africa was based on national identity, nationalism, and the nation state on the one hand, and individual rights on the other. What we have to remember is that Gandhi was extremely critical of this idea of freedom in its connection to a discourse of identity. So he pointed out that the rise of modern democracy in the West had coincided with the process of violent colonization, unprecedented in its scale. And that wars in the modern era, particularly the two world wars, were devastating in their impact, were after all wars that were based on a discourse of national identity. So Gandhi was convinced that this modern discourse of freedom was not a solution, but indeed a source of major problems, such as colonialism and wars. And I feel that we cannot grasp Gandhi's legacy of nonviolence unless we understand the significance of this difference between these two ideas of freedom.
How did the spiritual liberation beyond identity help Gandhi develop political alliances between, disparate groups?
In popular perception and in many scholarly works, Gandhi's anti-colonialism is often identified with nationalism. In my view, Gandhi was not a nationalist. Even as he created one of the most effective and unified mass movements against colonialism. Gandhi was well aware of the dangers of a discourse of nationalism, which insofar as it was based on identity was intrinsically connected to ideas and practices of exclusion. By the late 18th century and by the late 19th century and into the 20th century, the British had come to base their empire on a policy of divide and rule, and they used the modern discourse of freedom as part of that policy. As a result, by the 20th century, Indians were increasingly mobilizing themselves in the name of multiple identities, such as religious, caste, ethnicity, language, region, which created divisions in the anti-colonial movement. And that was Gandhi's major challenge. How do you keep this movement unified and consolidated? So it was in this context that the notion of spiritual liberation beyond identity and violence allowed Gandhi to bring together people and communities of diverse identities on one platform against the British Empire. Gandhi's insistence on nonviolence in this movement was essentially tied to his emphasis that all Indians make consistent efforts to rise above exclusive, specific identities, even as they fight colonialism.
Mm-hmm. Do you think these Gandhi's teachings you've just been talking about, are they still relevant to Indians today?
Yes, I think very much so. The government at independence fell back on a kind of modern Western discourse of identity and freedom. So this increasing division between people on the basis of religious identities, but also linguistic, caste, ethnic identities has led to escalating violence in India. As we know, Gandhi himself was assassinated by a Hindu nationalist, which goes to show how different Gandhi's politics was and that it went beyond this discourse of national identity. At a time when identity politics is increasingly turning violent, not just in India, but worldwide, it's worthwhile, I think, to remember the Gandhian legacy of a politics beyond violence and identity.
Mm-hmm. Oh, thank you, Miti. Really appreciate it. And now I'd like to come to our third guest, Tim Dobe. Thank you for being with us. And let me just ask you the same question. How do you assess Gandhi's legacy today?
Well, thanks for having me. And it's nice to see Rajmohan Gandhi again. We were honored to have him here at Grinnell a few years ago, and to meet and see again some of you as well. Thanks for your presentations and for having me. I'm not in a place to assess Gandhi's legacy, I would say. I can offer some comments on it. And I think as we've heard tonight, Gandhi's legacy is unsettled. Between Professor Yengde's comments and some tensions with Rajmohan's comments and kind of coming from Ambedkarite and Gandhian perspectives, these tensions are real. And they mirror very much, for example, some of the tensions in the legacy of the civil rights movement. So far, we've talked about that only in terms primarily of the mainstream civil rights movement and not the Nation of Islam, Malcolm X and other figures who were not happy, like Ambedkar was not happy with Gandhi's leadership. Some of the other more radical movements are kind of not remembered well, or just not remembered. So my own work has focused on kind of thinking about what's been forgotten or what gets marginalized. And when Donald Trump went to India not long ago, that event was marked. His visit was marked by tens and tens of Muslims being killed in the streets of New Delhi under Prime Minister Modi's regime. And so we've heard a lot from Rajmohan and others about the place of Muslims in the current Indian situation, but also I want to link that to the place of Muslims in the U.S. situation. And so for my own work, it kind of comes from the question of how have Muslims been marginalized in the telling and retelling of Gandhi's story and his legacy. And it's pretty striking in many ways, and I can only give you a few examples of that. But so, for example, at Phoenix Settlement, where Paul talked about visiting, I think in Durban, it was one of the places where that had been kind of destroyed. When I went just a few years ago, it has been rebuilt. And so it's preserved and kind of restored in many ways. But in the intellectual influence center where Thoreau is and the Bible is and all sorts of influence on Gandhi, what's noticeably missing is the Quran. There is no mention of the Prophet Muhammad. There is no mention of the Quran. And as Rajmohan said already, not only was Hindu-Muslim unity a major point for Gandhi himself, but Gandhi was deeply, deeply influenced religiously by reading the life of the Prophet, by reading the Quran. And this has largely been left out. There's only one book written about Gandhi's being influenced by Islam. Only one monograph. And how many books have there been written about Gandhi? So this is part of the unsettled legacy, I would say. And, it's not a mistake or coincidence that in the history of the US, Islam has been associated with militancy of a kind that is not assimilable to the white supremacist structure of our country, right? So you tell the story of Dr. King as a loving example that contrasts the so-called hate of Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam. And that is a story that has to be rethought and retold. And similarly, to connect to Professor Yengde's comments, Muslim identity is not identical to Dalit identity in India, of course, but there are also deep overlaps between them. One that, those that I'm kind of studying is kind of sociologically, many of the conversions of both Christians and Muslims historically in India are from those groups. And there's a reason why Dr. Ambedkar considered converting to Islam as one of his first choices to leave Hinduism and destroy caste, because there was no redemption, no reform, according to him. So I would say, in short, the legacy of Gandhi is unsettled. The critiques on race and caste are very relevant and important in being faced in new ways, I think, precisely because of Isabel Wilkerson's book and other things that we're hopefully more aware of in the US, speaking for myself as a white identified person in this context.
Mm-hmm. What for you are the lasting contributions that Gandhi made to his own time and the time since?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, I'm not alone, and it's probably summing up what some of has been said. I think David Hardiman is a scholar of Gandhian studies, and he talks about Gandhi's legacy. Probably the most important contribution Gandhi makes is not just nonviolent movements, but this technique of satyagraha as a force of resistance, as a strategic organizing principle, philosophy, and a technique that has been kind of adoptable and adaptable. And we heard Dr. Carson, I think it was, talk about Jim Lawson's deep training in that in India and bringing it back in a slightly new way. That was new for me. I didn't know that. So I want to thank him for bringing that to us. And we think of, Dr. King said, that the boycott, the bus boycott was, Jesus gave the spirit and Gandhi provided the method. So we do think that Dr. King was influenced by the method, but there's a depth to that and a kind of radicality to that changes throughout the history of the movement. So it's that technique. David Hardiman talks about that. And within political science, this is a kind of a major trend in the past 20 years, where there's a figure called Gene Sharp, who was a political scientist, and he recognized the kind of strategic importance of Gandhi and nonviolence when he was studying the Indian movement, and realized that though there is this philosophy, and for Gandhi it is a principle and he's a philosopher and it's in your body, as Dr. Alter was saying, at the same time, most people that participated in the movement, who made up the movement, whose skulls were cracked at the salt works and so on, these were not philosophers. These were people committed to a movement for liberation. And they did it for strategic reasons. And so there's a strategic approach to nonviolence, which kind of puts some of the philosophy to the side, I would say. And back to Dr. Yengde's points, I might point out that one of Ambedkar's first acts, public acts, was to adopt satyagraha as a method of resistance, as a nonviolent method of resistance. Though he wasn't philosophically agreed with Gandhi, he would use some of the techniques and even use Gandhi's term to describe, for example, resisting the exclusion from well water. So if you were said to be impure and pollute the well water, then he would insist on the right to bring Dalits to drink. He would burn the law books, the laws of Manu, that said that his fellow Dalits were impure. Public burnings of that, right, were like Gandhi's burnings of cloth, were radical public acts of resistance. And he shared that in a way. And we can see everywhere from Serbia to Iran to the Arab Spring to various movements, Black Lives Matter. These techniques of mass resistance in a more radical form that are not just, as has been said many times, not passive in any sense, but militant, I think is part of that legacy.
Miti or Paul, do you have anything further you might like to add before we close the discussion? Well, if not, I just want to say thank you so much, Tim Dobe and Paul Greeno and Miti Mukherjee and all of the guests who were with us earlier. It's been a really, really wonderful program. And so thank you all for being here. And I want to say thank you to the members of the audience. This is the last program of the season, but we hope you'll join us again this September when we reconvene. Recordings of all WorldCanvass programs are available on the International Programs website, on iTunes, the Public Radio Exchange, and YouTube. And this program is a production of International Programs at the University of Iowa. I'm Joan Kerr, wishing you a good night.